what are some protectionist policies? Because obviously the definition that I read out, I wasn't entirely happy with it. And there are plenty of policies that come under the umbrella of protectionism that you might not even intuitively think are protectionist in nature. So obviously there's things like the introduction of trade tariffs, which is effectively a tax on foreign goods, because they say, okay, well, a certain percentage of the price of this good has to go to government revenue. This obviously makes foreign goods more expensive. I mean, I'm sure you could figure that much out on your own. The price increase of foreign goods makes domestic goods more competitive with cheaper foreign alternatives, and thus reduces the supply of a foreign good in favour of increasing demand within a domestic market. So they artificially increase the price of foreign goods to make the domestic ones more competitive, and therefore you can preserve domestic industries.
Not just preserve, but encourage the development of.
Yes, but quite often the framing is preservation, in that there's an existential threat to the industry, domestically speaking, because some other foreign country has somehow cracked the ability to produce the thing much cheaper. It could be cheaper labour. You know, you could have a sweatshop in Africa making the clothes, and therefore it's as cheap as humanly possible. And then you can't really compete with that, or something along those lines. Therefore, tariffs on those sorts of goods might make your domestic markets more competitive. But a bit more hard line along the protectionist policies are import quotas, which set an absolute limit on the amount of a certain good that can be imported into a country, tend to be more effective than protective tariffs at the intended goal. Some might say too effective. It doesn't always necessarily have a positive impact on the economy, but if you're trying to have a very strong means of dissuading consumers from purchasing foreign goods, having import quotas is far more effective than the tariffs, because people who are willing to pay the additional expense can just completely ignore the fact that you've set up a tariff that's meant to dissuade you.
Yeah.
So another thing that I thought was quite counterintuitive to be lumped in with protectionist policies is product standards. So just ensuring that foreign goods adhere to domestic standards of safety or quality. So you get things like food standards, and you could have the case of Japanese fish being high in levels of mercury, and that's not going to meet our food standards.
No, of course. I think one, I don't know if you're going to get to it, one that you've missed out that's relevant to import quotas as well is just outright banning the importation of particular goods and services. For instance, in this...
Well, that would just be an import quota of a kind, just that the quota is zero.
Well, yeah, you could say that, but I think it's clearer to call it an import ban on certain products. Like, for instance, in this list discusses how the English, when they gained the territories in India, when they were expanding in the east, outright banned the importation of cloth products into England, because they recognised that, okay, they make them really cheap and they also make them really good. If we just allow the complete free trade of this, it will destroy our own cloth manufacturer. So they completely banned it, and then for whatever reason, as a result, it ended up spurring on a bit of the competition between the domestic cloth producers, and they ended up improving the quality and efficiency of producing their own cloth products. And then when it was at the point where, okay, we're very competitive on the international market now if we want to be, then they opened the trade back up for it.
Sure. So I will be getting on to sanctions later, but that's more...
Yeah.
That seems...
that's more kind of warlike policy.
It is, yes. Moving on to government subsidies, which are financial grants extended by the government to private institutions or other public entities in order to stimulate economic activity or promote activities that are in the public good, whatever that is. For example, the UK has farming subsidies, not necessarily because it's the cheapest to grow food here. It's more that for national security reasons, say we had our trade blockaded, you don't want an over-dependence on importing food.
And this is one of the important things that adds to making protectionism a bit more complex and pros and cons, is because free trade arguments, while in a perfect world would probably make a lot of sense, they kind of assume a perpetual peace between nations, which is obviously not something that's going to be realistic. And they can also actually promote economic, as you say, economic dependence from one country to another, which can lead another country to be under the power of another economic power.
But we're not necessarily going to focus on government subsidies in this, because we've only got a limited amount of time, and they tend to be somewhat consistent within countries. They don't change with the same amount of variability as, say, tariffs. And therefore, if they're somewhat static, somewhat less interesting, because they're not shifting geopolitical power dynamics or economic power and trade power and that sort of thing. And the final thing, which I alluded to previously, it is sanctions, which is typically a ban on trade, but can also be limited to certain sectors, which is the most common in modernity. There can also be exceptions as well. So you can have exceptions on things like food and medicine. So that's more humanitarian in its concern. So that's a sort of exception to a sanction where you oppose a government, but then the people on the ground don't have to suffer. They don't have to be without medicine or food or what have you. You can use the example of the sanctions that were placed on Russia, obviously.
Not so effective.
Yes.
Not so effective with Russia being able to have people just stream themselves wasting gas 24/7 for months on end, while people in the UK worry if they're going to freeze over winter.
The thing is that the sanctions on Russia were very specific as well, and it's quite unusual that they were placed on specific individuals, which prevented them from travelling within the EU, and they either froze or seized their assets as well. And these are people close to Putin.
I would imagine so. Although I think the problems that we're experiencing from Russian sanctions don't purely just come from Russian sanctions.
No, of course not.
They come from the fact that for net zero targets, for instance, we've been cutting off our own ability.
And of course, the actual war in Ukraine itself and the disruption to a whole
supply
host of
trade routes and whatnot. Yeah, but we really have hampered ourselves by making ourselves almost intentionally completely economically dependent on other countries' gas and oil, whereas we could have had the opportunity to build our own industry. And that's one of the benefits of having homegrown industries. They grant you a certain level of independence, which to the actual individual citizens of those nations actually grants them a greater degree of freedom.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.